Welcome to episode 144 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to share an interview with Dr. Travis Bristol on how we can attract, support, and build relationships with diverse faculty members, and why that's so important for all teachers and all kids. Visit truthforteachers.com to get the condensed transcript or to share your thoughts in the comments. This episode is brought to you in part by PeerGrade. It's a platform that makes it easy to facilitate peer review in your classroom. Students review each other's work, while PeerGrade takes care of anonymously assigning reviewers and delivering all the relevant insights to teachers. With PeerGrade, students learn how to think critically and take ownership of their learning, and they also learn how to write kind and useful feedback for their peers. The best part is that PeerGrade is free for teachers and students to use. To learn more, visit thecornerstoneforteachers.com/PeerGrade. So this was a really fun episode for me to do, and that might sound like a weird descriptor for a fairly heavy topic, but it was really fun because I learned so much from my guest, Dr. Travis Bristol. This is not a topic that I know a ton about. I wasn't actually even sure what questions I should be asking. And putting myself in the position of true learner is really fun for me. I enjoyed it so much. Travis was just a fascinating guest. This deep historical perspective that he views these issues through is just really interesting to listen to, and I think you're really going to love it. Let me tell you a little bit about him and the perspective that he's bringing to the table. Travis is a former teacher, and he's currently assistant professor at Boston University School of Education. A big part of his research agenda is centered on practices and policies that support teachers of color. He's also the principal investigator for the NYC Young Men's Initiative. That focuses on recruiting and supporting 1,000 male teachers of color for New York City schools. Travis has been featured on NPR, The Washington Post, Education Week, NBC News, all kinds of places. And when you listen to this interview, you're going to understand exactly why I'm so honored to have him share this experience and research here with us. I've asked Travis to speak specifically to the role of the individual teacher here. What can you, the classroom teacher listening right now, do to ensure that your school culture is one that truly believes in hiring and supporting a diverse faculty? So we're going to talk first about the challenges that Travis faced as a Black male teacher, and he'll explain why over 80% of the teaching workforce is comprised of white women. Then we'll talk about why a diverse teaching staff is so important, how it benefits kids of color as well as white children, and it benefits teachers as well. We'll spend the second half of the episode looking at how to ensure our schools are truly working to hire a diverse staff, not just engaging in tokenism. And we'll talk about what white teachers can do to build relationships with and learn from teachers of color. So, Travis, only around 2% of teachers in the United States are Black males, and you at one time counted yourself among their numbers. You're a former teacher in New York City. Can you tell us what that experience was like for you?
I think that teaching in New York City continues to be one of the highlights of my career. Because I got to, I returned to a district where I was educated. I graduated from the New York City public school system. One particular challenge that I've shared and that some of the participants in my study have also shared is this idea of being burdened to manage disciplinary issues. And there was this assumption that just because I was a male teacher of color, a Black man, that I would automatically know what to do with those students. And so you would, my administrators, my assistant principal and principal would walk by my classroom and of course see students on average sitting in their seats. But there were many things that I was learning about, right? I wanted to make sure that I was, I needed some help around engaging them, right, and making sure that the content was sort of rigorous. But just because they were sitting and complying didn't necessarily mean that they were learning. But because they were compliant and sitting, people thought that I could handle more, right? And so, in many ways, my burden became heavier because the administration began transferring some of these students into my classroom without helping my colleague, who was a white female, understand what she could do to get the students to behave in some of the ways that they were behaving in my classroom, right? So instead of supporting her and building her capacity to engage students, they made my work even harder by placing these students into my classroom.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot. I think a lot of teachers can sort of relate to this idea that, there's one person on the team who they feel like, they can handle all the behavior problems, so we'll just give them all to them. And it sounds like you were saying not only were they doing that to you because you had the skills in that area, but also they were sort of, making this assumption that as a Black male, you would be able to handle those kids better.
Right. Without trying to understand that I was in many ways building relationships with students, right? They were not trying to understand how I was doing the social and emotional piece, right? But rather just believing that just because I was a Black man that I could engage.
What else was that experience like for you? What else did you experience as a teacher that you felt like was sort of unique to your perspective?
So I definitely think that it was clear to me that I was a novelty in some ways to my students, right? In many ways, I think a novelty in some ways to to the students that I teach at Boston University. I mean, many of the students had few or had not had a Black male teacher. I think that they were really intrigued by me. But there was also this sense that because I was also this anomaly, that they also struggled to sort of try to understand me, right? And so because on average they had not been presented right through the media with positive representations of Black men, my presence in the classroom created some cognitive dissonance. Yes, like I am a teacher. I am not the after-school coordinator, right? That I'm here to teach you rigorous content, and I've been trained to do so. And so, I think that there can be this assumption that that just because you're a Black man, if you're just thrown in there, then automatically students will want to. They'll automatically engage with you, right? But I think for some of my students, because they had never seen on average someone, like me, it took them a while to grapple with the idea that clearly here I am and I am their teacher.
Right, because, at least 80% of the teaching workforce looks like me. They're white women, and I think that's what kids are used to seeing. And, to be clear right up front here, there's nothing wrong with being a white female teacher. We know that white teachers can do an excellent job building relationships with kids of color. I talked about that actually back in episode 106 with Principal Baruti Kafeli, and he explained some strategies that white teachers can use to build those relationships. So we're not in any way saying that what white teachers do in the classroom isn't valuable, because kids can learn well from any teacher who genuinely cares about them and really works to understand them and understand their culture on a personal level. But what we're talking about here really is having kids move up through the entire K-12 school system, and they have maybe one teacher of color, if that. And they may not have a male teacher until high school. I know that I didn't. So can you explain a little bit about why it's so important for kids of all races and all genders to have teachers of color and to see male teachers in the classroom?
Yeah, great question, Angela. I mean, and I think that to your point, we aren't saying that there isn't a place for white teachers. I give the example of Miss Shapiro, my 11th grade English teacher, white woman, who in many ways made me want to become an English teacher, right? I talk about the story of Miss Shapiro getting on a desk when we were reading A Streetcar Named Desire and yelling Stella, right? And then I said, I want to become an English teacher, right? One day. And so lo and behold, I did. And I taught for, several years, and I train English teachers now. So of course, right? I mean, my own life story, right? White female teachers have encouraged me, but I think that what we have to ask ourselves is that any time we see disproportionality, right, we have to examine what might be some of the root causes for for that disproportionality. And so, if 82% of all teachers in U.S. public schools are white, and about 50.3% of all students in U.S. public schools are of color, we have to ask ourselves, why is there this demographic mismatch? And so So some of my work, right, attempts to understand and unpack why that demographic mismatch is there. But sort of, to your question, why is it important? There is some convincing evidence, both qualitative research, that's research looking at smaller sample sizes, talking to individuals, right, and much larger quantitative research that's looking at larger numbers of people, looking at test scores, and much of that research is pretty convincing that children of color benefit, that they perform better in school when they have a teacher of color. And there is actually some emerging research that is providing evidence that all children, that white children, are saying that they prefer a teacher of color. So we do have some qualitative evidence, and we also have to ask ourselves, right? We are living in a global society, and if we are preparing children to be global citizens, then we have to have people in front of them who do not look like them, who bring different perspectives to the world, who can prepare them, right, to be global competitors. I think that having someone who, having a black male teacher or teacher of color in a position of intellectual authority can create some cognitive dissonance that can be helpful in making you realize that not only can this person, right, not only is this person, picking up trash, but this person can actually teach me something. And that prepares you to navigate and engage with the world where people are different from you. So not only, right, what I say, do children of color benefit from having a teacher of color, but white children, right, who need to be, who are going to be global citizens, right, deserve and are missing out on the opportunity to have a teacher of color teach them.
What you just said there about a person of color can teach me something, I think that is really, really powerful, because I agree with you that I think there's a lack of respect sometimes for people of color in leadership. I just love this way that you brought it back to our experiences growing up. If you never see Black males and as teachers, as people who are in a position of authority to teach you something, it's really hard to then see them in a position as, say, your boss, right? For them to move up the corporate ladder and to, be heads of companies or CEOs or, to be in these other positions of authority. And it really does start with, what do we see as children? And so it's important not only for kids of color to see teachers who look like them, but it's also important for white kids as well. So we're going to get into in a moment, what teachers can do to support and attract a more diverse faculty at their schools. But I want to give a little bit of a broader context here, a little bit maybe of a historical context too, because I think that's really important anytime we're trying to understand an issue like this as it pertains to race and gender. So can you tell us, or just talk to us for a moment about maybe some of the reasons why almost all teachers are white women?
Yeah. So I would say that historically we have had large numbers of Black teachers during segregation, legalized segregation in the United States. Black teachers were the only people teaching Black children. And one of the, as Vanessa Walker, for example, writes, one of the things that happened post-Brown or during school integration, right, was that when Black students went to work or went to schools with white children, when their Black teachers tried to go work in those schools, those teachers were not hired. So thousands of Black principals and Black teachers were fired and were not rehired during or after Brown or during school integration. So historically we've had them, but because of racist policies in the United States around hiring, we don't see those teachers. And in many ways, some of those racist policies still continue. So one example of why we don't have large numbers of teachers of color is because when we look at which students are suspended and and expelled from school, right? We see large numbers of children of color who are exited from the K-12 pipeline. Well, if those children don't even have an opportunity to graduate from high school, then they never have an opportunity to go to college, and they don't have an opportunity to become a teacher, right? So we lose large numbers of potential teachers of color from the K-12 pipeline because of harsh and discriminatory disciplinary practices that target children of color. We also know that some of those practices around preferential treatment and bias, racial bias in terms of hiring that happened during Brown, continue today. There have been some studies, 2 recent studies, that have found that Black teachers, when Black teachers and white teachers applied to work at schools with larger numbers of white children, that only the white teachers were invited back for interviews. In my study that I did on Black male teachers here in Boston, I looked at Black men in 2 types of schools. One set of schools had Black men where there were 3 or more on the faculty. The other set of schools had only 1 Black male teacher. Those schools that had 1 Black male teacher tended to be higher performing schools. And when I would ask, and they had many more white students, many more white teachers, and so when I asked those Black male teachers who were the only Black men on the faculty, right, like what were they doing to get more teachers of color? They said, they would join the hiring committee, but their colleagues would always use words like, "This candidate wasn't a good fit," right? And so those same racist hiring practices, right? Or bias is the coded word for racism in the 21st century. But those same hiring practices that did not that excluded Black teachers from the workforce post Brown continue today, and so that continues to be another reason why we see larger numbers of white teachers when compared to teachers of color, Black teachers in particular.
I've taught in schools that had a majority white teaching workforce, and I've also taught in schools where more than half, I would say probably 75% or more of the staff were people of color. And one thing that I've noticed personally is that teachers of color are far more likely to want to work in schools where there are other teachers of color. And that makes sense, right? Because I think very few of us as people want to be the only person in a building of our gender or of our race, or, who are like us, or our age even. I think we all look for communities where we can envision ourselves being part of a team and fitting in and having our contributions really valued. So schools with very few teachers of color and white administrators aren't likely to attract teachers of color. So I'm going to ask a question related to that, but I just want to make sure I'm on the right track here. Do you think that I'm characterizing the situation correctly? Okay.
Partly. So I think it is true, we use the word homophily, that people are looking for people like themselves because they believe that if they see people like themselves, then they're more likely to thrive in those spaces. So it is true that that one part of why we see large numbers of teachers of color in schools with other teachers of color, right, is because they may be attracted to those spaces. That is true. And I would add that, as I just mentioned previously, that there is a growing body of research, and I have evidence from this from my study on Black male teachers in Boston public schools, that schools that have larger numbers of white teachers are not actively seeking Black teachers, that they are only looking to hire 1 or 2 to maybe demonstrate to the rest of the world that they believe in social justice or they believe in diversity, but they are not looking to hire many Black teachers. And so I think that it is partly true that people are attracted to certain types of places, and it's also true that certain types of schools are attracted to certain types of teachers.
That's really, I'm thinking deeply about this. This is really good. You're pointing to throughout this conversation, you're pointing to basically biased or, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, but they're biased hiring practices where we're looking to sort of tokenize. Absolutely. We need our token male teacher, we need our token Hispanic teacher, we need our token Black teachers, just so we can check off the boxes. But they're not really looking for true representation. They're not really looking for any kind of situation in which, white teachers might become, the minority, or where there may be a culture of diversity. We're just looking for sort of tokenism. Am I understanding that right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I would give you, an example of this in some ways. So when I say a certain type of Black teacher in terms of white schools, that those teachers also have to have elite pedigrees, right? I believe in some ways that my pedigree from Amherst College, small liberal art, white elite institution, my bachelor's degree and my master's degree from Stanford University, that those types of pedigrees, right, made me more attractive to that school. If I potentially had a degree from a city university, right, as a Black male teacher, I would have been less attractive. And so one of the things that I found in my study on Black male teachers in Boston public schools was that the Black men who were the only Black men on their faculty, right, they were more likely to have degrees from like elite institutions. And so it is the case that people are saying that they want diverse candidates, but they're only willing to take a risk and have these sort of elite cutoffs for Black candidates at particular institutions.
So, if a teacher's listening to this, there's obviously, well, maybe not obviously, I would think that there's not much an individual teacher can do to change this dynamic because teachers don't make hiring decisions. Am I right about that?
So I think that in all the school districts that I've been a part of, teachers are actually playing, can participate and can join, they make hiring decisions. So I think that, if a teacher is sitting in on a hiring decision or part of an interviewing committee, then they can push the committee to have a more expansive view of what it means to be a good fit for the school. So that's one way that teachers, right, could be agents of change in this process. And also, if they're not sitting in on hiring committees because they may not be senior in that way, they could also urge their principals and their colleagues to say, having a colleague of color might be helpful because a colleague of color might be a cultural navigator potentially in some way. And so while I may not be able to sit on a hiring committee, I do recognize that having a person of color will in many ways make me a better teacher because they might be able to teach me things, right, that I may not have been able to learn because of my Eurocentric K-12 or undergraduate schooling experience. And so they can encourage administrators and their colleagues to consider applicants of color if they're not necessarily sitting in on those hiring decisions. So absolutely, I think teachers can be agentic. White teachers can be agentic in this process, as well as parents, right? I think that white parents in particular, right, can play a key role in increasing the number of teachers of color because, as a parent myself, I know that school administrators listen to parents, and they can say, they can take a step back and say, look at my children are missing out on something because they don't have people who reflect the rich diversity of this country. What can we do? How can we create incentive packages or look at hiring to ensure that they have a more diverse faculty?
So then this is something really that we should be thinking about, as teachers, if we have our own children and they're, in our local public or even private or charter schools, to make sure that we're advocating for this for our own children's schools as well. As parents, I really like that role because I think you're right. Parents have tremendous influence.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Parents can play a key role in this. Absolutely. White parents.
Are there things that individual teachers can do in their interactions with fellow staff members as well to sort of welcome and support diversity? What can they do to make schools sort of a safe and welcoming place where the perspective of male teachers and teachers of color are valued?
Yeah. one of the things that I found in my study on black male teachers, particularly those men who were, I call them loners. These were men who were the only black men in their building. They often talked about eating lunch in their rooms by themselves with their students.
Mm.
And so, if I am a white teacher, and I am recognizing that, when it's lunchtime and I'm sitting in the cafeteria, and there are teachers of color in the building, but they're choosing not to sit in the lunchroom, what might it be about the toxic nature of the lunchroom that's not becoming a welcoming space for teachers of color? What conversations are we having about children, about their families, that might make this space uninviting for faculty members of color? So I think that white teachers can look around the room and see, when we have social gatherings, where are the faculty of color? With whom are they talking? And if we see them not talking or not present, we should ask ourselves, well, what are we doing? What's the conversation that's happening that's not making it a space for all teachers to be present? White teachers can learn, right? They can learn from their black male teacher colleagues or their colleagues of color to understand, well, how are you engaging the student? What are you doing? What content are you teaching? How are you talking to their families? How are you talking to them? And then try to adopt some of those practices in their own classroom rather than just sending them these students for them to police, right? So I think white teachers can try to understand what are some of the things that their colleagues of color are doing that are so successful, and try to incorporate some of those practices in their own classroom.
Are there any sort of pitfalls or biases that teachers should watch out for in their interactions with teachers of color or male teachers?
There can't be this assumption that just because you are a man of color that you automatically will bond or want to be a father, right? Mm-hmm. Figure to a boy of color or a student of color, right? While I had men present, male figures in my own life, right? I personally, Travis Bristol, did not grow up with a father in my house. I was raised by a single mother. But to have people assume that I knew how to be a father figure mm-hmm. to other students when I myself did not have a father, right, is as a father like in my house, right, becomes a sort of very dangerous positioning of people who themselves, right, have never had this kind of experience. And so I think that one can't assume that people know how to or even want to become a father figure. Ed Brockenbrough, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, talks about this idea that that we can't position black men to become father figures because they may not want to, and the students may not want them to be.
Mm-hmm. What's something that you wish that every teacher understood about his or her role in attracting and supporting and building relationships with diverse faculty?
Well, one, that everybody can play a role. It's if you are just by your day-to-day interactions, right? So many people want to bring people of color. School districts want to bring people of color into the profession, into their schools, without thinking about the experiences of those and the conditions in those schools to keep people there. And so you can't say first that you want to bring people of color into your school building if you yourself are not in community with those people of color. And so I would encourage people first to ensure that they are building really strong and meaningful relationships, right, with their colleagues of color. Because I think what many white teachers and white administrators fail to realize or recognize is that if I, a person of color, am not having a positive experience in my building, then I am not going to reach out to my social network to encourage people to come and want to apply to this space, right? And so, white teachers have to ensure that the people of color, that they're building strong and positive relationships with their colleagues of color. So their colleagues of color will want to share with their network that this is a place to teach. So I think that in a very practical way, right, being in communion and in fellowship with your colleagues of color is important.
Can I ask you to give some specific examples? If there's a teacher who's listening to this and wondering, well, how exactly do I build those relationships? Because we do have people of color in my building, but I don't really know what to do to sort of build that bridge. I like your point earlier about being conscious of the types of discussions that we're having about kids, because we know that you mentioned specifically the staff room, we know the ways that sometimes people are complaining, venting, they're frustrated in there, and they're speaking about kids in a way that can be, you can reveal some very limiting beliefs and some deficit mindsets in those kinds of conversations that can be discouraging to someone, especially if we've got a teacher of color and we're talking about students of color. All sorts of implicit bias can come out in those conversations. So I think being aware of what you're saying, and I think your point earlier about also letting people of color lead, being willing to listen, trying to value their conversations are important. I'm wondering what else you would sort of add to those things.
Yeah. So I would say I would ask a colleague of color who you believe is having some success with students. I would ask them if you could sit in on their class because there's some things that I need to learn. I mean, I see that you're doing X really well. Could I observe your class and get some tips or some pointers about what you're doing so that I can incorporate it into my classroom? And then after sitting in on their classroom and trying those things out in my own classroom as the white teacher, I would then invite my colleague of color, right? Would you mind coming into my classroom? I've tried on this particular teaching move or this practice. Could you give me feedback on it? And I think that interaction where you position yourself as a learner, as someone interested in understanding how this teacher is enacting practice and valuing their teaching, suggests to their colleague that you clearly honor them and see them as a teacher, and those kinds of things begin to build really positive relationships. And of course, right, as people come to your classroom and you observe them and they observe you, right, then you also begin to ask them questions about their trajectory to becoming a teacher. Would you be willing to share this practice with other people in the school? I think that those are some of the ways. But I think that one particular way, the way to begin the conversation has to be around practice, right? Because the thing that makes everyone, the similarity there is that everyone is a teacher. And so the conversation first, I believe, has to be around teacher practice or something about practice. As a way to build a relationship that might extend to some of the positive social, that can create positive social dynamic. But I think it has to first begin thinking about and getting feedback on and learning from someone's practice.
Right. So start with the practice rather than just trying to build a friendship, rather than just being friendly and try to work your way in.
Yes, because that would strike me, or I suspect it would strike me anyway, or someone is being very inauthentic, right? Because why are you trying to be my friend, right? I mean, we're teachers. So I would say, how can you position yourself first as a learner from that person's practice, and then from that practice, a relationship might emanate. Yeah.
If you want to connect with Dr. Travis J. Bristol on Twitter, his handle is @TJacksonBristol. Or you can search on Twitter for Travis Bristol. You'll be able to find him. You can also connect with him on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Want more than just a weekly podcast episode from me? I'd love to also send you a weekly message of encouragement via email. I'll reach out each Sunday evening with a short message that's designed to help you feel more prepared and inspired and motivated for the week ahead. It's not a newsletter or a bunch of announcements. This goes out to over 85,000 educators. So I put just as much thought into crafting this weekly written message to my email list as I do into crafting my podcast episodes. And it's entirely unique content that you won't find anywhere else online. Just go to thecornerstoneforteachers.com/subscribe and you can sign up. That's thecornerstoneforteachers.com/subscribe.